Excellent. So welcome. Today we are going to do a webinar titled Planning for Meaningful Inclusion. And our focus today is going to be using a protocol-driven process to really get to the heart of your child's needs to plan for the most effective program for your individual child. My name is Maureen Blajeski, and I'm an education consultant who works through the 321 Foundation. I consult to the Massachusetts Down Syndrome Congress, and we are working together with DSAIA to bring these webinars to all of you. I want to give you a little bit of my background to let you know where I'm coming from when I speak to you about some of the things that we're going to share today in terms of how to plan for your child. So my 10,000-foot perspective really comes from a lot of multiple experiences that I've had. So I have a personal connection to an individual with Down syndrome. My niece Lily is 10 years old, and I'm very, very close to her. She goes to school with my daughter. I see her every single day. And so as an educator who then had a child with complex learning needs enter into my life, it really has helped shape the perspective of somebody who's looking at a child from much more of a big picture day-to-day perspective. I also have had the opportunity to work with many, many different children with Down syndrome through my work in planning for and working with children through the learning program, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, and a program called Adventure Club, which works with graduates of our learning program here in Boston, doing out in the community activities. I also worked for 17 years as a public school teacher in the trenches. I was a special educator long before any of these personal experiences came into play. So the day-to-day perspective of teachers I'm very familiar with because that is the bulk of my professional experience. Additionally, over the past 4 years, I've been working as a coach or a consultant to teams within multiple school districts related to planning programs for students with complex learning needs. And I have a lot of experience also working with families through my role at the Massachusetts Down Syndrome, through the learning program, and through my sister. The reason I give you that piece of background is that what I'm going to share with you today didn't just come to me overnight. It really has developed through all these different experiences and through being able to see the multiple perspectives of everybody who is creating an IEP for a student. And while it's important for me to share my background, I also think it's necessary for me to come to the table and say that because of all those experiences, I have a specific lens through which I view my professional practice. And because I've worked with students with complex learning needs for so long, I believe very strongly that every student needs to have a program that focuses on multiple areas. Students need to make sure that throughout their day, throughout their programming, they have the opportunity to develop the skills that they need to be a strong communicator and to interact with people in their community. They also need to have access to parts of their program that will help them develop skills related to independent living. They also need to be able to access the general curriculum in order to build the background knowledge that they deserve to have so they can participate in conversations with peers throughout their life. They need to have access to opportunities that will support the development of skills related to behavior and self-regulation. And they need to have the opportunity to access programming that will help develop skills related to academic competency. So all of these things are equally important. And all of these things will support the long-term whole person growth of any student. not even just students with disabilities. Every student needs opportunities to develop all of these skills. For some of our students, the skill development needs to be more intentional and more upfront than we may for a student who has less complex learning needs. I'm sure that everybody on this webinar today, or who will be viewing this webinar, recognizes that the value of inclusive education is unmeasurable. And I have long been a proponent for inclusive education. And one of the things that I have taken the time to do, and I'm not going to read everything that's on here, for those of you who get this recording and have access to this PowerPoint after, please feel free to read my own personal reflections around what inclusion really means to me and what I advocate for my students on a day-to-day basis. I believe that inclusion goes beyond the geography of where students are learning, and inclusion is very much more focused in a culture and the overall community in which all of our students are learning. I believe that inclusive education encompasses the unique strengths and vulnerabilities of every single learner that we work with, whether they have identified quote unquote special needs or not. Each one of us is working on something, and a truly inclusive community offers all students to develop an understanding and an empathy towards everybody's unique pattern of strengths and weaknesses. And it also finds ways to give everybody what they need. And what everybody needs isn't always exactly the same. And for the growth of our students, I think that a strong inclusive culture will mean that we can say, this student needs something very specialized for this small part of the day because that's how they're going to learn. And that might look a little different than what their peers are doing. And within a truly inclusive community, that's going to be flexible for all students. So it's important for me to set this perspective as I launch into some of the nitty-gritty of what I'm going to talk about, because that's a very strong core belief that I have, and it really informs everything else that I do. So I want to stop there. All participants have the opportunity to type in some questions in the question pane of your toolbar on your screen. At a couple of intervals throughout the webinar, I will stop and address any questions that people may have. So right now, before we launch into some of the bigger picture things to consider when you're planning for your child's IEP, if there's any questions about what we've talked about so far, feel free to type them in, and we'll be sure to address them as we move forward. So looking at programming for students from the big picture lens, I'm going to speak about a couple of lessons that I've learned throughout my career and through my personal experiences working within the educational community for students who have complex learning needs. One of the biggest pieces of advice that I really feel is important to give to all teachers and all families is that we want to make sure that we are not comparing IEPs or programs between students. When we overgeneralize recommendations or individual education programs based on a specific diagnosis or a specific school, and what really happens is that we lose sight of the fact that IEPs really must be grounded in facts related to individual students and their own unique present strengths and vulnerabilities. While it's really important to understand learning profiles and what research tells us about how kids learn, we really want to stay grounded in where this student is right now and what that individual student requires at the moment. A second big picture lesson that I find is sometimes easier to say rather than do, so I'm acknowledging that on the outset. I would say to the majority of families, if at all possible, try to stay focused in the present and resist giving into the what if anxiety. Now, that being said, I have spoken to many, many families throughout my career, and there are situations where families have a lot of reason to fear the what if scenarios because of things that they've experienced or just how things have worked historically with their individual teams. In my experience, I would say that the majority of the teachers that I've worked with and the majority of schools that I've worked in, I would say that parents and teachers all have the collective best interest of the student in mind. And if we can, as much as possible, try to stay grounded in that and not let ourselves focus in the what if horror stories that we may have heard from other families, it will help have a much more productive IEP meeting. I think that for any of us as parents, anytime we start to go to the what if scenarios, it can really increase our anxiety about anything related to our children across their lives. And I would say that, you know, the advice that you would have for anything for your student, for your child related to, you know, try not to go to those catastrophic scenarios, I would say, if at all possible, try to do that when you're planning for your student as well. Another really important point that I think is important when we start talking about the specifics of IEP planning is that when we're talking about students with complex learning needs, it's not often helpful to talk in the two black and white buckets of inclusion or exclusion. For most students, it's very rarely all one or all the other that will really meet their individual needs. And I think it's important for us to remember that the presence of one doesn't necessarily mean the absence of the other either. You know, I can say that throughout my career, I've seen students who are 100% of the time present within their general education classroom. And I would not say that because geographically there was inclusion happening, that there also wasn't some significant exclusion happening in terms of how that program actually was executed, versus students who I knew had a flexible program where they spent a lot of times learning alongside their general education peers. But there were times when they received specialized instruction outside of the classroom. And I could honestly say that the inclusion for that student was much more rich and much more meaningful. So I think that the labels of either of these things can prevent us from really looking at the real big picture of what's happening for a student. So those are some of the big picture pieces of advice that I think are important to talk about whenever we're talking about planning for an IEP. I want to move into some of the nuts and bolts, especially related to some of the protocols and templates that can be used for information gathering. Before I do that, I want to invite anybody to type questions into the question pane and we can address them. If anybody has any throughout, just type it in and we'll make sure that we address them throughout the webinar. So now we are going to look at some of the nuts and bolts of this. We've established the big picture context. So now what do we do? It's time for us to plan that annual review meeting. It's time for us to sit down and, review all the data from the 3-year reevaluation. How do we really move ourselves towards a productive planning process for the student? One thing that I would say to every single team that I work with is that you should never identify the conditions before you identify the outcomes and the goals for the student. This makes everybody's job harder when we start with the conditions. So that being said, if a team begins a conversation with educational placement as the first thing to consider, that is something that we have to put the brakes on. Educational placement should never, ever be the first thing to consider. We need to look at what are the outcomes that we want for this student. We need to say, what are the goals? What are the areas that we really want to target in terms of specific growth for this student right now? And then we must work backwards to ensure that those individual needs are being met. When the conversation begins with, here's the placement for the student next year, everything else becomes secondary, and that creates a program that isn't necessarily meeting the individual needs of the student. It's really important for everybody sitting around the table at an annual review meeting to really have a very broad, big picture understanding of where that student is at that moment in their lives. On here I have a picture of my niece when she was in 1st grade and my niece when she was in 4th grade. And when it comes time for her annual review meeting, everybody should have a really good idea about where she's at in terms of each of these domains. It is really important that we're not sticking to where she was in 1st grade and what her needs were a couple of years ago, because in 4th grade, her skills related to academic competency, behavior and self-regulation, her access to general curriculum, independent living, and interpersonal skills are very different. And there's also the fact that as she's in 4th grade, her team may want to focus more heavily on a specific domain at this point in time than they did when she was in 1st grade. So for example, for my niece in 1st grade, there was a very, very heavy focus on communication and interpersonal skills and skills related to behavior and self-regulation. It was very important for the team to make sure that she had the self-regulation skills to know how to learn when she was in 1st grade. And while that's something that still needs to be addressed, it's not as heavy of a focus as right now. Skills related to independent living is something that the team agrees is a more important specific area of focus than she needed 3 years ago. So it's important for everybody to be on the same page and know exactly where a student is at that moment in time. It's also important to make sure that when you're sitting around the table, we really prioritize effective inter-team communication. It is a time when we're talking about students who have complex learning needs, it is very easy for everybody around that table to have very high emotions. In our current educational climate, when we are comparing all students to a specific standard and level of achievement, it's very easy to look at students through a deficit lens. And sometimes people come to the table and they are immediately defensive that they have to either defend, for parents, I know they feel like they have to defend the strengths of their child, and for teachers, Sometimes they feel like they have to defend their practice and why a student is at where they're at. And emotions can be high when we're communicating defensively. And when we're communicating defensively with high emotions, the actual message doesn't actually come out, and it's very non-productive. So more than ever, when we're sitting around that table together, it's really important for everybody to be open and prepared for a collaborative discussion that will really allow for a creative problem-solving process. And one way to do this is to enter into the IEP meeting with the idea that it's going to be a systematic, process-driven planning process. And by doing that, we really ensure that essential information is going to be shared among every single person on the team. When we use this process-driven planning process, it becomes much, much more student-centered. And the lens through which every single IEP plan should be created is really through the student and their individual needs. I have found throughout my 20 years in education that anytime we share factual information on paper, it is a much more powerful tool than when everything is shared verbally. It's similar to how we would want to teach our students in our classroom. Once it's in the air, it can be misinterpreted. It can be interpreted through the lens of whatever emotion you have at that moment. But when information is shared on paper in a factual way, it is less likely to get reinterpreted or reframed into something that has a different perception than what it was meant. So I would encourage every team to make sure that every single person at that table has the opportunity to reflect on these big areas. Every student should be looked at initially through what are their overall areas of strength. We really want to sit down at that table and be able to say that this student shines here. Where does this student shine? Where has they made progress? Where have they made progress? Where do you see this student really having those aha moments and really growing in terms of the type of instruction that really meets their needs? Think about your student and when they shine and share that, because that is essential information as we move forward and plan. Then we want to think about what are our areas of short-term growth for this student. It goes back to where are we really seeing the momentum in terms of their progress, and what are the next foundational skills that we think that this student can achieve if we continue along that trajectory. So where are they at right now, and what are the next smaller steps that we see them demonstrating? We also may want to take that at this time. We also want to say that there may be an area where we would probably expect more growth. However, for some reason, the conditions haven't been established for the student to be showing growth in that area. For example, speaking of my niece in 4th grade, those skills of independence, this is the time when we want to say, we want to really target skills of independence over the next year. It's important for everyone to have that conversation and speak about the student, and not as much about what they're not doing compared to their peers, but where are they at right now, and where do we genuinely see that they're going to grow, and let's make a plan for that to happen. The third area where everybody needs to be on the same page is related to what's the long game for this student. It's really hard for teachers right now who are, again, working in a climate where there is a message of all students need to get from point A to point B within a defined amount of time. That's what the standardized assessments are really all about. Teachers are giving curriculum with pacing charts. It it can be really hard to make sure that we're thinking about 22. We're thinking about where this student is going to be when they're an adult, when there's no longer any educational supports. Everybody really needs to stop and visualize this student and when they're an adult. And that's going to also help inform what our plans are for them for over the next year. So one of the things that all of you will have access to after this webinar are some sample templates that can help guide your conversation related to putting down on paper some information about exactly where the student is right now. Here's 3 examples of ways that you can organize your thoughts on paper related to what a student needs. You will not need to use all of these planning protocols every single time. That will probably end up being more cumbersome than actually productive. Sharing these with your team and deciding which ones will be most beneficial to the planning process for the student at this time is really what these tools are designed for. So for example, the one on the bottom, the team planning document, Skills of Independence. That's something you may want to use if that is going to be a particular area of focus for any student throughout their educational, throughout, you know, any grade level or any point in time as we plan for them. An additional, you know, we also have the student-centered brainstorming protocol, which is really just on paper those 3 big buckets that I think every team should think through. Sometimes that is, it makes sense to just take this and jot a few things down. It might make sense to really talk through it at the meeting, but it's just a way to remind us of what are the specific things that we want to be thinking about for this student. Another protocol that you will have access to after this webinar is related to, there's a way to think about each of the domains and really document what is working for the student right now. And once you've been able to identify what might be working for a student under any one of those domains related to self-regulation, academic competency, communication, we can then think about, okay, this is what's working, but here's something that I think we could do in addition to, or in replacement to something that might enhance the student's program for the upcoming year. One of the biggest messages that I think is important in terms of the protocol, and a protocol that I would recommend that each team uses every single time we come to the table and plan for a student, is that as we look at the upcoming year, as much of our planning should be grounded in the reality of the actual day-to-day of the student. So it's really hard to plan with only theory in mind when we're really talking about the nuts and bolts of a student's program. When we talk about how we're going to deliver service and how we're going to focus on certain areas, we really want to think of it in terms of what will a 2nd grade classroom look like? What does a day in 7th grade look like? What does a 10th grade theoretical schedule look like? It's harder to retrofit goals and service delivery into a structure that doesn't already exist within your child's school. And a great example of this is that if a student has a great IEP developed within one school and then they move to a different district or a different school, it's hard to execute that program within the structure of just what the culture and the day-to-day program of that school looks like. So I think we should always do that when we're planning for students. This protocol is essential for making sure that when we're planning for students, we're thinking about making sure that we are being intentional about supporting growth across all of those 5 domains that I talked about earlier. One way to do that is using this template and plugging in a theoretical daily schedule for the upcoming year for a student. So here's the first page of a theoretical schedule for a 2nd grade classroom. How does the day begin? It begins with morning routine and morning work. What you want to do is really break the day down really by the same chunks that you're developing your visual schedule on the board. You want to put it down, and then you want to be very specific about this student and ask yourself the question, what kind of support does this child need to access this part of the day? Will the student be able to access within the general education with no additional supports? If that's the case, check that off. But if it is not, and if we know that that student will require some supports, be very specific about what those supports are. Well, I know that this student really can't execute the morning routine independently. We'll need to give them a checklist. This student has a behavior plan. We want to make sure that as soon as they walk in, our behavioral expectations are established and clear and consistent. And we know that this student really needs a preview of their day. We want to make sure that we're giving this student what they need at that time. Let's look. What's our plan for that? Let's make a checklist. Hey, instead of doing the morning work, which is more academic based, at this time, this student is going to have individualized morning work that will focus on executing a routine that will really focus on reviewing the rest of the daily activities, reviewing the behavior plan and behavioral expectations, and that way we're setting the student up for success for the rest of the day. What are the primary areas of focus for this small chunk of the day? We're really focusing on developing skills of self-regulation and skills of independence, because we would hope that as we move forward in the year, the student will need less and less adult prompting related to how to execute that morning routine. This is a great time of day to focus on those 2 areas. So you would want to move through the day and really break it down to the specifics of what does a student require to access this part of the day. So for this particular student, when it came to the reading block within the classroom, we identified that what this student requires in order to make progress with the identified reading goals is that they really require specialized, targeted instruction that focuses on decoding and comprehension. So we know that that is a time where we're building in specialized instruction from the special education teacher. When it parallels what the student is working on, this student would work within the general education classroom if the goals and objectives of the particular lesson within the class mirrors what the student is going to be working on. But when students require something that is really specialized and independent and requires one-on-one, the student is going to work individually with the special education teacher. With this particular student, that was a way that we really wanted to make sure that that reading block was heavily going to target the academic growth of that particular skill. When you look at a program this way, it becomes much, much easier to really think about the logistics, because the logistics, brainstorming and problem solving around the logistics are really what make a program successful. It allows us to think outside the box in terms of the identified existing resources within a school. You really want your team to think flexibly and take risks. You want your team not to get very stuck in the this is how we always do it, which is where they'll revert to if they don't feel like they can take risks within the program or think outside the box within the program. So I'm going to give a very concrete example of where I've really seen some success in terms of how a team was encouraged to think outside the box and use the resources in a way that provided a very meaningful program for a student. So this is a real life example from my practice. In my school, there was a student with Down syndrome whose placement on their IEP, they came into kindergarten in our school with a self-contained placement on the IEP. However, the majority or very much of this student's day was within the general education classroom. However, what this student did receive from the special educator who was technically within that self-contained classroom was targeted specialized instruction for targeted goals and objectives related to specific academic skills. So what happened within this program is that that self-contained classroom teacher played the role of the service delivery provider, and the paraprofessionals associated with that program were the primary additional support. So the reason that this was very successful is that in our school, I was the kindergarten through 4th grade inclusion specialist. So the primary special educator who was in charge of the programs for the students who had very complex needs that were 100% included in general education, while there were other special ed teachers who delivered instruction, I was the primary special educator working with close to 25 students grades K to 4. I had a single paraprofessional who supported me. Because this student received his targeted specialized instruction from the special educator associated with this program, he was able to receive he was able to be supported with resources that were spread much less thin than the resources that were quote unquote associated with me as the inclusion specialist. And his inclusion program was very, very, very meaningful. He really got what he needed because this team thought outside the box and used this particular resource in a way that was really unconventional in terms of the service delivery. The student wasn't in that classroom all the time, but it was a way to use that resource in a very, very effective way. When you are sitting at the table, it's really important to be very specific about your child's needs. You want to make sure that you talk about exactly where you want to see growth. So we have to keep in mind that inclusion is not a goal or a specific instructional technique. It's a culture and an environment in which specific skills can be developed. So when you sit at the table, it's much more effective to say, I want Johnny to develop communication skills that will allow for him to develop meaningful relationships with others in his community, versus saying, I want inclusion for Johnny. Because when you really say what you want the outcome of I know all of us have inclusion in mind, but why? I want their communication skills to be strong. I want them to be regulated and access curriculum. Be specific about those parts versus simply saying, I want inclusion for my student. Because one of the things that is true is that there are countless benefits to inclusive education. But what's hard is that they're not all very easily quantifiable or even measurable within a single year's time. I think we see that with students with complex learning needs, where a student who has been included for several years with their typical peers, it sometimes takes a while to really see where some of those skills have developed. It's not always as easily quantifiable within a single year's time, which is why you really want to think about those 5 domains and be really specific about what you want to achieve in an inclusive setting? Why is an inclusive setting important? One of the last things I do want to talk about before we're done is related to developing an IEP and remembering that there is a big piece of teacher accountability built into IEPs. So your special educators, in particular, your teachers are absolutely held accountable for ensuring that the annual benchmarks and objectives that are put on that IEP are achieved throughout that year. And we want to make sure that the IEP is not being developed with goals and objectives that can't be met through the service delivery program that we put into place. So again, a very specific example of what I mean by that. When I was a special education teacher, I had two students in third grade math that I used to support every single day. I used to go into their classroom, I would modify the curriculum, I would create access points for them to be able to participate in the math curriculum alongside their peers. These students were well supported, and this was a very positive learning experience. However, one of the things that were on their goals and objectives were very specific goals and objectives related to specific number sense concepts. And while we would touch upon that, these students spent the majority of their math time really accessing curriculum and not necessarily receiving the targeted spiraled practice for those specific math skills that were outlined on the IEP. So while participation within that class absolutely had clear benefits, they were mostly within developing skills related to development of communication and interpersonal skills, related to behavior and self-regulation, and related to access to general curriculum. Those things were absolutely happening for that student in that classroom. However, when it came time for progress reports, I was being held accountable to report on their progress on the goal related to academic competency. And in a third grade class, it was really hard for me to really report on specific competency related to number facts, these very, very, very specific goals. So what we want to make sure is that when you're developing the IEP, we want to make sure that we remember that instruction designed to support access to curriculum is different for some students with complex needs. The instruction designed to develop mastery of the skills will look different than access to curriculum. And so when you sit down at the table, keep that in mind and make sure that if we're really going to put on the IEP that we want mastery of skills, we have to think about exactly how that student is going to get there. And if, like these two kiddos that I worked with in class, they really needed one-on-one distraction-free practice in those skills, and it was hard for us to do that when we were always paralleling the general curriculum. So we really want to make sure that every single child's program in a perfect world is designed to access specially designed instruction, access learning opportunities with non-disabled peers, and access to a school culture that is really undergoing ongoing introspection and development of a culture that values diversity, and it really actively works to support all students' understanding of individual differences. If those three things are happening, then we have a really strong inclusive program for a student where they're going to make maximum growth. So Before we log off, I would love to address some of the questions that have been asked. So the first question is, was there a reason the services were not pushed in? His services could still be provided in LRE, even if the self-contained teacher was delivering. And I think that's a great question, and I addressed it a little bit later on. For some students, that's absolutely what we need to focus, which is why we want to use that initial protocol where we're looking at what does this student require during the day. Some of my students did quite well when I was delivering specialized instruction within the gen ed classroom. I had other students who were more vulnerable to distraction and more vulnerable to really having a hard time focusing on the lesson that I had prepared for them within the gen ed classroom as their students were working and moving around them. What that student required was a more distraction-free setting, which is why for that particular student, his services related to some of those goals and objectives were delivered in the self-contained classroom. But the majority of this student's day was within the gen ed classroom. So that's a great question. Let's see. Oh, great. Are there any other let me see. There's another question here. Hold on one second. So this is an elementary experience. Oh, the talk seemed to be based in an elementary experience. I'm sorry. Hold on one second. Let me just make this box a little bit bigger so I can read the question a little bit easier. Excuse me while I just technologically make sure that happens.
There's a little pop out there. Can you see above the?
Do see. Oh yes, here we go. Okay, great. Okay, yes, thank you so much, Dina, for the technological support. So one of the questions is related to, part of the message was not to get caught up in educational placement. That's what I'm doing. But what's the right choice in an individual learning plan when general recommendations or traditional axioms conflict? For example, a student with an IEP should not be retained because existing social relationships are key, and Down syndrome students are often recommended or expected to go to kindergarten for 2 years. Yeah, that's a very hard question. I think that in my experience of working both with parents and teachers, it's hard because I think that different schools and different families and different teams have either more or less flexible feelings related to the question of retention and what's the best decision for any individual student. And I think that's where it gets hard if the conversation moves from this is how we do it, period, versus, okay, let's weigh the pros and cons of each scenario for this particular student. Because I would say that for some students, perhaps supporting the relationships might be what's best for them, whereas other students will, if we think about what would be the benefits of a second year in kindergarten, you may be able to highlight the specific pros to that scenario in a way that would lend itself towards the team supporting that recommendation. And that is a challenge. It's hard because every student is so individual. I would say that my biggest recommendation would be to sit down and do a pros and cons of each of those scenarios for the students related to their growth in each of those domains. I also want to touch upon Joe's question related to how middle school what does that mean? And I'm glad you actually brought that up. A lot of the work I do is focused in a middle school. And this model works just as well for a middle school as it does for an elementary school. I would say that a middle school, when you look at that theoretical schedule, really going through each part of the day and identifying what a student's specific needs are for each part of the day is something that can sometimes be done much more effectively at the middle and high school level. If you think about it, students are kind of always in a different place every 45 minutes. So it really lends itself to a unique, individualized program where sometimes we can customize it easier in a middle school to exactly what a student needs. What I've seen in some middle schools is that there is a broader choice of electives that a student has access to, and a lot of the robust inclusion experiences, not just an identified general curriculum classroom, but they really take advantage of some of the elective experiences to enhance the inclusion programming for a student. So for example, in one of the districts that I work in, they have an ocean studies elective, which is really a science, but it's not as standards driven as the general education science curriculum, in which there's going to be some accountability with an MCAS. And it was a place where this student really thrived because it happened every single day and it was an elective that they were participating in. So I think that really thinking about which if you have a student who you feel that the entire day keeping up with the pace of general education would be very fatiguing for this student, very frustrating, maybe be a detriment to self-regulation, really pick maybe a single class within the general curriculum or two classes that you think that this student will really be able to access and receive the previewing and reviewing that they'll need to feel successful and be able to access the curriculum in this class. But I would really encourage all middle school teachers to especially use this protocol, because sometimes because the day is often naturally structured in a way that really lends itself to success in this type of planning. I hope that answered your question, Joe. I'm going to also include some additional resources to think a little bit more specifically about upper grade planning using a protocol like this. One thing that I do want to address is another question from one of the participants related to who says that kids with Down syndrome should go to a kindergarten for 2 years? Is this more of a Massachusetts practice? Most inclusion specialists suggest that they move on with their peers. I would say that I don't think the conventional wisdom is that most students with Down syndrome should do anything related to either repeating a year or not repeating a year. I know students who have done both. I know that I have met and worked with many families who have advocated for retention for very specific reasons, and the team has agreed that because of those reasons, the student did a second year in kindergarten. But I also know just as many students who did a single year in kindergarten and moved on with their peers for just as equally compelling reasons related to that particular student. So I just want to be clear that, similar to in the beginning, how it's really important for us not to compare IEPs or programs, that's something that we want to make sure that if you're going to make a recommendation or advocate for something for your student, you really want to think about why something is very important for your student. And using some of the planning templates that I'm going to give you, it'll allow you to really focus on those domains and think about why you may be advocating for retention. Is there a specific domain that you really feel like needs to be heavily focused on? Why do you think another year in kindergarten is going to be more beneficial for focusing on that area, then moving on to first grade, then it's really factual based and individual student based. So another question, and I know that there's a lot of questions here, so I'm trying to address them all. And I also want people to know that you will have access to this webinar. So I understand that, you know, time, we try to do these midday ones to see if people can kind of squeeze it in at lunch. But if you need to log off, please do. I am going to make sure that I verbally address all of the questions that are here right now, but you know, I want people to make sure that they log off when they need to. I'm actually going to interrupt addressing the questions for one moment, just so we can do the polls before individual people might need to log off. Please feel free to stay on if you can, but if not, we would really like to get some feedback from all of you. So Dino, do you think we could do the first poll?
The first poll is up.
Great. So for those of you who are still here, just take a minute to just give us some feedback and tell us a little bit about yourself. And, you know, let us know who you are, who's the audience, who's with us today. We take your feedback very seriously, and we really do try to design our webinars with the feedback that you provide us in mind.
We have about 71%.
Okay.
A couple of more seconds to click on the poll. If people are listening, they may not have access, so we're at 76. And we'll give you just another 10 seconds to finish up.
So so Dina, if you will just keep having the polls pop up, maybe I can address some of the questions, just verbally talk while people just answer them. So there's 4 questions, just make sure you're paying attention to them. Please, that would be really helpful to us. So another question is that my daughter does well at home when using some my daughter does well at home with some teaching techniques she is used to. However, when trying to share this with the teachers, they insist on using their approach. How can I help? You know, that's a question that I think a lot of families struggle with. It can be particularly frustrating for families when you see how well your student responds to some of the instruction that you do at home with your student, one-on-one at home, and it's frustrating when it doesn't exactly parallel what's happening in the school. What I would say is that I would absolutely continue to share what works at home with your child, with the team, because that's really important information for the team. What I would also say on the other side is that we want kids to be able to tolerate lots of different types of instruction. So if the team is delivering instruction in a slightly different way and your student is showing progress, that's great too, because as your student moves forward in school, the different types of instructional techniques that they're going to have access to will be a little bit different depending on the teacher's style, depending on the year. So it may be that if you see your child responding very well to a specific instructional style that's one-on-one, very targeted, very specific, that may be where you want them to consider doing that type of instruction to address specific goals and objectives on the IEP. And it's also important to think about how within the school, your child is going to be learning in a lot of different types of environments, and sometimes it's hard to replicate a specific instructional technique within a certain environment. So I know that with my students, for example, like a more ABA, very targeted, almost discrete child type of instruction is harder to do within a general education classroom when there's a lot going on around the student than it is if this student is with me one-on-one in a distraction-free place, which probably more closely resembles what it actually looks like in your home. A lot of times when parents are working with their child at home, it's one-on-one, quiet place. I mean, I don't know your child, but you want to remember that it's instruction looks a little different depending upon the environment of where the student is at. So I would continue to share it, but hopefully they'll be flexible and hear you, but hopefully they're also building your child's stamina to be receptive to lots of different instructional styles. So let's just look and see what else we want to address, because I want to be mindful of people's times. Let me just address this. Do you have advice for families who are moving to a new school district? Specifically, how should we reconcile an IEP that was created in one district but moving to another in terms of resources and placement? That's a great question. I think that would be a place where when you move, and if you sit down at the table and use that, what does a day in that child's new school look like, and then really talk through your child and what their needs are, then the IEP could be tweaked to meet their needs within that structure. I think that's a scenario that a template like that can be very, very beneficial. So I hope that's helpful. I have another question. So student is far below standards of his grade in Gen Ed. Accommodations for academics do not exist, and the team pushes hard for all academics to be in special ed, which is frustrating. And I think a lot of families have that. And your follow-up question related to, are academics modifications possible when the Gen Ed class tasks are far above the students? My answer to that is absolutely. There are absolutely ways to modify and find access to general curriculum for students who are not at the same level as their peers. We have another webinar on the MDSC YouTube page, a series of webinars that talk about using the Massachusetts Curriculum Frameworks Resource Guide. I know that's really long. I'll say it again. The Massachusetts Curriculum Frameworks Resource Guide is a resource that we use here in Massachusetts that breaks down each of the curriculum standards and really shows a spectrum of entry points into the curriculum. Like I said, there are several webinars specifically related to that. If you want to email us at the MDSC, we can give you some more information about the nuts and bolts of how teachers can look at modifying curriculum in a way that students who are working at a different level as their peers can access and learn alongside their peers. That is a great question, though, and lends itself to a completely different webinar. So I think that was an important one. So thank you for asking that. So another question, these are great questions. When pullouts do not happen in the respective subject, so if a student requires pullout in reading or math, but is actually being pulled out for a chunk of science and social studies, how do you advocate for, how do you insist that pullouts happen within that subject area instead of missing, the access to general curriculum in science and social studies? I think that is a great, great question. And I think that's when you want to go back to hopefully being able to advocate using a template-driven protocol. and really talk about the specific skills that the child will be growing when they have access to the science and social studies curriculum. When a team does do pull-out during that time, it is, I would guarantee it's 100% related to the resources within your school and scheduling. I know for myself, when I had a certain amount of kids on my caseload and I had to create a schedule within the school day of supporting grades K to 4, knowing that I had this many hours of push-in, this many minutes of push-in, this many minutes of pull-out with students in 12 different classrooms, it got really hard. And I would say that when you're advocating, I would talk to an administrator, because I would guarantee that your teacher is doing the best that they can related to your student is doing your teacher is probably doing the best that they can based upon their caseload and the actual schedule. However, your point is very, very valid. But speaking to administrators and talking about how you're concerned that there may not be enough special education resources to ensure that your child is able to access the curriculum at this time, because the special educator may be spread too thin. I think that that's a really important point and point of advocacy that you as a parent can do that will absolutely support your teachers. Okay, so I want to, question regarding accommodations and modifications would be a great webinar. Nope, we will definitely do that. We're always looking for topics that would work. I think that another question is related to, hold on, I know I missed another one. What do you know when a school introduces a computer-based program in general education? And hold on one second, let me just read this. So this question looks like it's focused on how there's a computer-based program that's being introduced in general education. And how do you modify a lesson plan for a student with Down syndrome how do you help them access a computer-based general education program? Which is a really good question. And I think without knowing the specifics of that program, it's hard to say exactly how you would do that. But I think that some computer-based programs are more focused on developing specific skills, which they have, assessment programs. It's individualized for the student, and it may be that the school, if the students are working on this computer program completely individually to develop skills like math facts or phonics, they may need to look at an alternate computer program that better meets the specific needs of your child at that moment. However, if it's a very curriculum-based computer program, I think that bringing up your concern to the team and saying that switching from a teacher-instructed curriculum to a computer-based curriculum interferes with a child's ability to access the curriculum, that's something you really should bring up with the team and have them talk about what their specific plan for that would be. So I know it's a kind of a vague answer, but not knowing exactly what it is, I would want to make sure that you would have that. Okay, so we're going to do one more question, and then I'm going to let everybody log off. I think that we've addressed all of them after this. So do you have a template that helps teachers list actual activities they plan for each subject, then list what modifications or accommodations a child will need to participate? Currently, our teachers don't do that, and I think if a teacher has to plug in their plan and really look at how my child will participate or access curriculum, they'll really be able to see that your child can't access it. So I think that you're absolutely right that it's important for teachers to be able to look at their planning and really be able to see where the barriers to access are for your students while they're planning curriculum. I definitely do have some templates for that, and I can share them with you. And it's and you write how they're not really hearing your voice with that, and that is frustrating. I would say that the majority of teachers, when I think that you're feeling like you're butting heads in that area, it really comes down to they often really just don't know how to do that or how to look at it that way. So I'm definitely going to share some resources with you that hopefully will you can maybe share with your team, and they can walk through that planning process a little bit. So I have to say, you guys were amazing. I really appreciate all the feedback and questions, especially at the end. I know it can be a little hard in this interface, but you had such great, thoughtful questions. So thank you all for taking the time to be here. You will access the recording to this, and I'm going to share the resources with Dina, and she can share them with you. And you know, stay in touch, and hopefully we'll see you at a future webinar. Thank you all so much.